Inspector Goole from an Inspector Goule's 30 quotations, but no, we only want 10, but which 10 do we want? Let's find out.
Hey everyone, it's me, Liam, aka Mr Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video, as if the title hadn't already made it clear, I will be analysing 10 key quotations that centre on the character Inspector Goole from J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. I will also summarise the character for you and provide a quick discussion about what Priestley's intentions may have been when writing him, ideas that could contribute to you achieving the top grades. Make sure that you've got a pen and paper in front of you so that you can take notes of the things that I say over the course of the video, as most of them won't be appearing on screen. Please do not forget to like, comment and subscribe if this video has helped you out, as it helps me out too. Here is my quick summary of the Inspector. He is only ever known as Inspector Goole, the Inspector, or Goole during the play. His identity is rooted in his alleged profession, whereas the lack of a first name further shrouds his personal identity in mystery. And yes, his surname Goole sounds a lot like ghoul, Ghoul, which is a spirit or ghost, which perhaps hints at the inspector's otherworldly near omniscience. He claims to be only recently transferred to the area. The stage directions claim that he is in his 50s. This means that he is roughly the same age as Mr and Mrs Birling, which aids to the contrast that is set up between him and them. His socialist views clearly oppose their capitalist views. And it seems that he is apparently a fraud, as the characters find out later in the play that there is no Inspector Goole in the local forces, which makes us wonder, just who is the Inspector? And the answer is, we don't really know. The Inspector is a mysterious figure who inspects, passes moral judgment, and exposes damaging truths. Before we look at specific quotations about the Inspector, I thought I would give you a piece of generic analysis that you might find useful. As I was scanning through the play when preparing this video, I noticed that he speaks a lot and asks an awful lot of questions. Of course, a police inspector probably should be speaking a lot and asking a lot of questions when conducting an investigation, but this does also show that he has an awful lot of power. By asking so many questions, he is controlling the topic of conversation, and by speaking so frequently, he is asserting conversational dominance. Now, if you're given an extract in your exam for this text, and the question is asking you about Inspector Goole or power, you could pick out one of his questions, assuming one is present in the extract you're given, and explain how and why his use of questions allows him to assert his power. So there you go, bonus analysis done. Now, let's look at 10 specific quotations. Just as I have done for each character so far, I thought I would start by looking at the stage directions that describe the character. For the Inspector, they say, "The Inspector need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s, dressed in a plain darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before speaking." As the stage directions are made up of 3 sentences, I thought I would say something about each one. The first sentence, which ends with purposefulness, suggests that the Inspector is strong-willed and determined, suggesting that once he has decided to do something or seek out some information, he will not give up. The second sentence, which describes his age and clothes, establishes that he is in opposition to Mr and Mrs Birling. His plain darkish suit contrasts nicely with the formal and somewhat decadent evening dress that the rest of the characters are wearing. This contrast may hint that the inspector comes from a different background to the Birlings and Gerald, and could be seen to represent the comparison between his socialist views and their capitalist views. Finally, the last sentence describes the way he speaks and looks at people. I suggest that it portrays him as being a bit intimidating, but not aggressive. He is the sort of person who demands respect and expects the truth. Our next quotation is one of the first things that the inspector says. In response to Mr Birling offering him a port or whisky, the inspector retorts with, "No thank you, Mr Birling, I'm on duty." As well as showing that the inspector is polite, given that he thanks Mr Birling as he declines his offer, this quotation shows that the inspector is incredibly professional, an effect which is added to by the short declarative sentences that make up the inspector's dialogue. Having this serious, ultra-professional police inspector enter the play marks a sudden change in mood. This is the moment in which the play's earlier joviality twists into grave seriousness. Our third quotation comes a little later in Act 1, when Sheila claims that it's a rotten shame that Eva/Daisy struggled and was feeling desperate after Mr Birling sacked her. The inspector responds by saying, "There are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, Miss Birling. If there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. Ask your father." This quotation clearly presents the inspector as holding socialist views as well as anti-capitalist views. By showing an awareness of the plights of young women across the country and not just in Brumley, the inspector's socialist views are shown. These are developed further by the second half of the quotation, where the inspector criticises capitalists, represented here by the factories and warehouses, which is an example of a technique called synecdoche, which is where a part of something is made to represent the whole thing or vice versa. The inspector criticises capitalists for exploiting young women by paying them barely enough, as highlighted by the phrase cheap labour. The final sentence, "Ask your father," allows the inspector to turn his critique from generic to specific. He is making it clear that Mr Birling is very much part of the problem. Quotation number 4 follows from Gerald claiming that we're respectable citizens and not criminals, to which the inspector says, "Sometimes there isn't as much difference as you think. Often, if it was left to me, I wouldn't know where to draw the line." Here the inspector's dialogue challenges Gerald's claim that they are all respectable citizens, a claim that he makes, presumably, because of his social class. I'm making this assumption because Gerald's dialogue seems typical of the us versus them mindset that the upper and middle classes held when thinking about the working class. By challenging this view, the inspector says that it is hard to distinguish between respectable citizens and criminals, and so he may be highlighting the fact that the upper and middle classes are more than capable of behaving in criminal ways, especially with regards to how they treat and exploit the working class. In doing this, the inspector is attempting to tear down class divisions, something typical of his socialist mindset. Our fifth quotation is another example of stage directions. They say, "massively taking charge." Now really, I could have picked from loads of different stage directions and still have made the same point. The inspector's authority and dominance is asserted time and time again in the stage directions, which inform us that he often interrupts other characters when they are speaking, steps in before full-blown arguments emerge between the characters, or otherwise draws attention back to himself and his line of questioning. Stage directions similar to the example on screen now appear throughout the play. The fact that they are so frequent is somewhat unusual. Generally, stage directions are pretty minimal or infrequent in most forms of drama, as the playwright leaves their text open to interpretation and allows directors to make their own decisions when putting on a play. Priestley, though, is different. He exerts greater authorial control through his use of stage directions, which demands that the characters in his play act and behave in certain ways, regardless of who is directing the play. In particular, Priestley demands that the inspector, an apparently classless, identityless socialist, reclaims a position of power throughout the play, subverting the power balances seen in 1912, in which capitalism was the dominant political mode of thought and socialism was a developing, yet ultimately powerless, force. Quotation number 6 is addressed to Sheila and Gerald. The inspector says, sternly to them both, "You see, we have to share something. If there's nothing else, we'll have to share our guilt." So I've selected this quotation as it best depicts the inspector's stance on guilt and social responsibility. Rather than blaming either Gerald or Sheila for what's happened to Eva/Daisy, he suggests that their guilt is something to be shared. This is quite balanced and non-judgmental from the inspector, as he is not ascribing guilt to any given individual. By doing this, he makes guilt, and therefore responsibility, a shared communal thing, which ties in with his socialist views, as things must be distributed equally, even if they are as negative as the guilt of a young woman's death. As the inspector is speaking sternly to them both, I argue that he has adopted something akin to the persona of a teacher. Although he is reprimanding the other two characters to an extent, he is not shouting and screaming at them. Instead, he is using this as an opportunity to educate Gerald and Sheila. By exposing them to socialist views, he may be hoping to correct their way of thinking. Next, we have the inspector's response to Mr Birling claiming that he is a public man. To this, the inspector states, massively, "Public men, Mr Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges." One important factor about this quotation that isn't present on screen is that the inspector is in fact interrupting Mr Birling, as shown by the dash at the end of Mr Birling's line of dialogue, which is an incomplete sentence. Interrupting is of course one way of exerting power, but what else does this quotation show? The stage directions, massively, are quite unusual, as we often use the word massively to describe the physical side of something. My interpretation of this is that the actor playing the inspector should say the following line of dialogue in such a way that it sounds incredibly important, serious, and profound. By speaking it in a way like this, and presenting the dialogue almost as if it is a piece of profound wisdom, it also makes it much more difficult to disagree with the message that is being conveyed. But what is that message? The inspector tells Mr Birling that he has responsibilities as well as privileges. To be honest, I don't think that this is an example of the inspector speaking only to Mr Birling. I think this doubles up as Priestley speaking to his audience. The message implied by the inspector's dialogue is that the middle and upper classes, which of course include Mr Birling, use their power and status for their own benefit, but they do not use any of the perks that they have to help the less fortunate out. In essence, this is the inspector trying to teach Mr Birling the ways of socialism, or, if you'd prefer, by highlighting the selfishness exhibited by Mr Birling, who only uses the privileges afforded to him by his class for himself. Priestley encourages his audience to consider adopting more socialist modes of thought. Our next quotation comes quite late in the play's second act. When Mr Birling asserts that they do not need Eric there, the inspector once again interrupts him and says, "If he's not back soon, I shall have to go and find him." Really, it's the stage directions that I want to focus on. They say, Birling and Mrs Birling exchange bewildered and rather frightened glances. The joint reaction of the two senior Birlings is what I would like to focus on. Remember, when writing about a character, you don't just have to focus on what they say. You can look at how they say things using stage directions, what other characters say about them using their dialogue, or even how other characters physically react to them, again using stage directions. Mr and Mrs Birling exchange bewildered and rather frightened glances when the inspector says that he will have to find Eric. Bewildered means confused, which implies that the inspector's motives are still somewhat unclear to these characters, indicating that he is an enigma. Furthermore, because their exchanged glances are rather frightened, it is suggested that the inspector, in his mysteriousness perhaps, is intimidating, especially as he is exerting his professional power in their domestic space. Mr and Mrs Birling are likely to be unsettled by the inspector, given that they are used to having power and doing what they want with it, especially in their own home, rather than having somebody use their power on them. You could even argue that the inspector is so intimidating that Mr and Mrs Birling cannot speak to each other. They are that frightened, unsettled, and confused. It is important to note, though, that the inspector has not behaved in a particularly threatening or physically aggressive way. I do not think that he is a bully particularly. However, he could be seen as frightening for a much scarier reason. Ultimately, he has challenged the very principles that Mr and Mrs Birling use to inform their entire lives, and he has exposed them as being wrong. Our penultimate quotation is even closer to the end of Act 2. I have selected it for analysis as I think it's quite interesting, for reasons I hope you will see in a moment. The inspector says, as Mr Birling tries to protest, turns on him, "Don't stammer and yammer again at me, man. I'm losing all patience with you people." Prior to this, Mrs Birling made classist remarks about Eva, describing her as a girl in her position, meaning incredibly poor and working class. The inspector, as he tends to do, makes a dark comment about Eva's position being on a slab in the infirmary. The inspector's bluntness provokes a response in Mr Birling, and seeing that he is about to interrupt, the inspector preemptively cuts him off. Now this quotation is interesting as the inspector's air of professionalism has faded. He has snapped at Mr Birling, outright telling him, as seen in the modal verb don't, to not stammer and yammer at him again, indicating that he views most of Mr Birling's prior conversational input as being meaningless nonsense. The inspector states that he is losing all patience with you people, and I think it's clear that you people means the Birlings and Gerald, aka the middle and upper classes. This venomous utterance, you people, shares a resemblance to Mrs Birling's earlier girls of that class. But whereas Mrs Birling's comment is born out of class prejudice and feelings of superiority, the inspector's utterance is born out of exasperation. In fact, the very thing that has exasperated him is precisely Mrs Birling's classist comments, and more broadly, he has been frustrated by the inability of the middle and upper classes to accept responsibility for their actions and their inability to show compassion towards the working class. By presenting the inspector as exasperated, Priestley has demonstrated the clash and incompatibility between socialism and capitalism. As long as he remains socialist, the inspector will be frustrated by the Birlings and Gerald, and as long as they remain purely capitalist, the Birlings and Gerald will never learn from the inspector's messages. And our final quotation is the final section of the inspector's final speech. To be honest, his entire final speech could have been its own video. In this final section, he says, "One Eva Smith has gone. But there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us with their lives,
their hopes and fears,
their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do.
We don't live alone.
We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will come soon when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." Right, I hope you've got a pen and paper ready, because there's about to be a lot of analysis. So, the repetition of millions and millions and millions is extremely emphatic, almost hyperbolic, as the inspector creates the impression that the plights that plague Eva/Daisy's life are an epidemic that causes the whole of the working class to suffer. Creating this image, of course, highlights his socialist views, but also presents him as compassionate and deeply understanding of the working class. In the phrase, their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, which is an example of triadic structure, the inspector juxtaposes opposites, as seen in hopes and fears and suffering and happiness, which emphasises that it is the responsibility of the middle and upper classes to decide which future they will permit the working class. Will the middle and upper classes behave selfishly and irresponsibly and doom the working class to a future of suffering and fear? Or will they behave compassionately and responsibly and enable them to live a hopeful, happy future? The inspector's final speech uses direct address and inclusive language frequently, as seen in the frequent use of we and us, which has the effect of not only bundling himself, the Birlings, Gerald, and the millions of Eva and John Smiths into one pile. No. Priestley has also ensured that this use of language has also included himself and his audience too. The direct address and inclusive language tears down or completely ignores class barriers and instead focuses on the one thing that matters: each and every person's humanity. Moving on, Priestley has incorporated a list of 3 declarative sentences in the second half of this speech. They each begin with we, and so this list of 3 also exhibits anaphora. By posing the inspector's ideas as straightforward facts, which the declarative sentences have achieved, Priestley makes it all the more difficult to disagree with them and their message, which I hope you can see is that we should all look out for and look after each other. Indeed, these 3 sentences call back to something Mr Birling claims earlier in the play, when he rubbishes the idea that we are responsible to each other and that we should look out for our fellow human beings. Furthermore, the sentence "we are members of one body" also has a biblical tone to it, and religious allusions we might see in just a little moment. Finally, the inspector ends his speech with a threat. He alludes to fire and blood and anguish, which I hope is a clear allusion to the terrors of World War I and II, although you could also interpret it as hell. Despite the inspector's warning, these wars still happened, although that's obvious, right? Because a fictional character written after the wars cannot prevent them from happening in the first place. However, Priestley's audience may see this as an indicator that the Birlings and Gerald did not learn their lesson, and so the wars happened. With the impact of the two wars still incredibly raw for Priestley's audience, they would have been anxious to avoid another. Perhaps out of sheer terror, Priestley was hoping that his audience would learn from the inspector's lessons and adopt a more socialist viewpoint. Consider the author's intentions, and you should find it easier to reach the top grades. So, when Priestley wrote The Inspector, what were his intentions and aims? So I think it's fair to say that The Inspector thoroughly exposes the faults of the middle and upper classes. Certainly, without The Inspector, there would be no meaningfulness to the play. By exposing the middle and upper classes so thoroughly, Priestley may have wanted to remind his audience, who would of course most likely have been part of these classes, of their own faults and flaws, especially with regards to how they treated or mistreated the working class. Some of the things that the inspector reveals about the Birlings or Gerald may hit a bit of a
nerve
with members of his audience, who in turn may realise the flaws of their actions and be inspired to behave better in future. Secondly, I think that Priestley wrote the inspector in the way that he did in order to demonstrate power's positive potential. There are many types of power shown in the play. This could include the political and economic power exerted by the capitalist characters, the patriarchal power used and misused by the male characters, or the societal and hierarchical power manipulated by the middle and upper classes. And I think, on the whole, power is not shown to be a good thing in this play. Except, that is, when the inspector is concerned. He uses his power as a police inspector to force the Birlings and Gerald to face up to the terrible things that they have done. The positive potential of this power is seen in Sheila and Eric, who learn from the inspector and begin to change their ways to something a bit more socialist. By changing those two characters in this way, I think Priestley would have argued that power has been used to transform the world for the better. And finally, the inspector is very much Priestley's mouthpiece. Priestley was of course a known socialist, just like the inspector is. And here is his chance to have an influential socialist character correct the wrongs of capitalists, or at least prevent them from causing more harm. Through his writing, Priestley was able to voice his political opinions and reach audiences that may have otherwise been inaccessible to him. Priestley's play is political. It was politically inspired, it contained political tensions, and it has a political message. Through writing it, he may have been hoping, even in a small way, to improve the world. So there we go. Goole has been summarised, analysed, and the motivation for creating him has also been discussed. But what can you do next? Well, of course, before you go, you can like the video if it's helped you out, drop a comment on it, and subscribe to my channel if you aren't already. But as well as that, you could choose to carry on making notes. I only ended my discussion of the inspector with his final message, but that is not where the play ends. You could carry on reading up to the end of the play and continue to make notes about how the inspector is presented. How do the other characters talk about him? How do they act? You could even just look at the stage directions following his departure. How are the other characters acting here, and what does that tell you about the inspector? Now, whether or not you choose to do that, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what you deserve to be.
So there we go, that is Inspector Goole analysed. But if you had to sum him up in, say, one word and one word only, which one word would that be? Please do let me know down in the comments. Cheers.